I teach here. We're a school of public leadership, and we're about making public policy around the world better. And tonight we're going to have a discussion that I think is very much in that frame about the surprising, remarkable success of President Emmanuel Macron in France, and in particular, the success of going from relative outsider status to President of the Republic in a very short period of time. And this is something that is being discussed now in the United Kingdom as there are questions about the political center. And one of our guests who will be joining us very shortly is going to be speaking from that perspective. But it raises questions for those, like many of our students here at the Blavatnik School, who study political organizing. And how is it that you can overcome the disadvantage of having no campaign structure, no basis in society, no set of mayors who are out mobilizing people to get you electoral candidates? And Emmanuel Macron figured out this very difficult task, and he succeeded at it brilliantly. At least he got himself elected. And the question remains, what will he do once elected, and what is the interaction between a president who creates a party from below, if you like, and then once he comes into office says, well, I'm going to adopt a Jupiterian style, and so in the mode of Jupiter, and so Jupiter seems to sit above and not come from below, so there is a certain amount of tension that we'll hope to talk about today in the context of Macron, the expectations he's raised, the activists of Marche, and how they deal with the president in an ongoing way, and what we can look forward to from Marche. So let me introduce my guests. To my immediate left, this is Guillaume Liegey, who is the head of LREM, a leading European campaign technology company, and he was instrumental in bringing Macron into the modern world of technology and politics. And he's going to tell us a little bit about that story. And it's not just a technology story. It is a technology story, but it's especially an organizing story. And we'll talk about where that came from, how it happened, and how one might learn from it when we're learning to apply it in other situations. To his left, Sudhir Hazareesingh, who teaches at Balliol. He's the author most recently of In the Shadow of the General, Modern France and the Myth of de Gaulle, an OUP book from 2013, and How the French Think. And those out here who are thinking, well, the French think really differently than everybody else, Sudhir will be able to answer those questions and others about them. And he's going to talk especially from the perspective of the challenge facing the government, having created this new party and a new set of expectations among the people in the party. We will be joined very, very shortly, I am promised, by Lord Andrew Adonis, the former chair of the UK National Infrastructure Commission, former Transport Secretary, Schools Minister, and head of the number 10 unit in Downing Street in the Labour government. And Lord Adonis is going to talk especially from the perspective of, well, there's this movement that arose in the center in France, and a relative political outsider came and did something like that, and could that be exported elsewhere, say here, because there's a lot of discussion now about the current state of UK politics, and is there room for a party of the center? And Lord Adonis had experience with that experiment in the 1980s as well, and he'll speak from that as well as from his substantial knowledge as a political intellectual of the center. But right now, I'd like to start with Guillaume. And if you could, Guillaume, take us back to Barack Obama 2008, what you learned and why that mattered for Emmanuel Macron.
We could also say to Liegey and Culpepper 2008, because that's when we met 10 years ago at the Kennedy School of Government. Yes, so to understand Macron, I'd like to actually ask you to come with me and go back 10 years ago in the United States, because if you want to understand what happened to Emmanuel Macron, you have to understand what happened in campaigning over the past 10, 15 years, starting in the US, and how this crossed the Atlantic to be applied by someone who was started from zero. So I promise to be brief. Pepper told it, yes, I am the CEO of a leading European campaign technology company. Thank you very much for using those words. I'm also French, which explains the accent, and sorry about that. It may improve as I speak more English, so after 10 minutes, probably it will be a bit better. What I indeed would like to, sorry.
Thank you.
Hello.
So, Lord Andrew Adonis has joined us now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So as Pepper suggested, yes, I'd like to go back 10 years ago in 2008 when Barack Obama ran his first campaign. And I'd like to tell you a bit about my story there, because I was amazingly interested in politics. And when I arrived on the campus of the other Cambridge, I realized that everybody was taking part in the campaign. It was very hard for someone interested in politics not to want to join, the volunteers. The problem is I had a very strong French accent at the time and no connection with the Democratic Party, no connection at all. So what did I do? I went to a guy who had a Yes We Can t-shirt and I asked him, hey, I'm Guillaume, I'm French, but I like politics. Can I help? Can I join the campaign? And he looked at me and said, dude, you go to the website and you register. So that's what I did. I went to the website. I left my name, my phone number, my email, and my zip code. And literally 2 hours after that, a real person called me and asked me, Guillaume, what are you doing on Saturday? So I can't do the American accent properly, but
yes.
But he was an American organizer from Barack Obama's campaign, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he said, "We're going to New Hampshire to knock at doors. Would you like to join us?" And I was like, "Okay, let's not be French and try this new thing." And so I went. I met them in the parking of the Whole Foods, and then I received a brief training as well as 10 other volunteers. Then we went on cars and we drove to New Hampshire, which is a swing state. That's the reason they were sending volunteers to New Hampshire, and to Manchester, actually, which is a city there. And they chose a very specific neighborhood, and they told us, they gave us a list of streets, of addresses, and told us, go knock at doors and use the script. And Guillaume, by the way, if people ask you where you're from, say you're Dutch, because they're not fans of French people. And so I'm told, so Dutch is okay. And the accent, they didn't get it. So I went, I was actually fortunately with another experienced volunteer. So we knocked at doors for 2 hours. It went really well. No one asked actually about my accent or whatever. It went really nice. But I had no idea why people were knocking at doors in the 21st century for what was supposed to be the most modern campaign in history. Because knocking at doors, that's super old-fashioned. That was actually my perspective there. So on the way back from Manchester to Boston, I asked our organizer, what's this all about? Why the door-to-door? And why did you choose these very specific neighborhoods? I mean, it's a big city. We could have gone, it's a big state. We could have gone in many places. Why those very specific houses? And then he gave me an answer that has since then shaped everything I believe in terms of what modern campaigning is about. And it's, the magic formula of campaigning today. It's about data, technology, and human. And the human part is very important. So the data you may have understood from the story I told, it's about targeting. Where do you find the voters that you can convince to support your candidate? And they're not everywhere, so you have to target them. Technology, well, if you want to build a movement from scratch, you better use technology. And I'm not talking about Excel. So something more sophisticated, because when you're managing 1.5 million volunteers, as the Obama campaign was, you need a tool to organize them. And why human? Because when it comes to changing people's mind, face-to-face interaction is the most effective way to do it. And it's not Guillaume Liegey who says that. It's research, actually. Campaigns have become scientific in a sense that there has been a lot of randomized experiments, scientific experiments, to measure the effect of different campaign techniques. And it happens that the more direct the contact is, the higher the chance that you will convince someone to vote and support your candidates. So that's kind of that was what I learned from this session and then many, many interviews with people from the Obama campaign. But it's a nice story, but it's an American story. And I'm French, and I don't know if you know French people, but telling them that they're going to campaign the American way is not exactly something that people will support like this. And the other problem is, we don't have the same data. I mean, we don't have the same, culture. American people, and I know that from Pepper, they're very nice. They hug all the time. But the French people, they're not nice. They don't like to be disturbed at home, We don't like that. So the thing is, can this work in a very different context, meaning the European context? And the answer is yes, of course it works everywhere. The idea that human interaction is at the center of politics, I don't believe it's an American idea. I don't believe it's a French idea. I believe it's a universal idea. I was in Brazil last week trying to convey the exact same message. And the other thing is, there's a lot of data available everywhere. This is Paris, divided into approximately 900 neighborhoods, and this is the result of the first round of the presidential election. Orange is Macron. The point is there's more and more data, which makes it possible to build sophisticated targeted models outside of the US. In France, this is Milan in Italy, Barcelona, Berlin, and São Paulo. So that's the first thing. So data works. And the good news is engaging with people face-to-face is also something that is powerful in France, in Germany, in Italy. I'm mentioning that because as a company, we've been involved in campaigns in all those countries. So that's kind of the story I was trying to tell Macron when he called me in the summer of 2015 and started thinking about how he could, do something more than being just the economy minister. The problem is, at the time, Macron, as you said, had nothing, no party, no money, no supporters, no elected officials. And he had the Obama example in mind, but he wanted to perfect it. And that's what I wanted to talk about before finishing. Macron had the intuition that if he wanted to build a solid new political movement, it had to be built with people, in a sense that volunteers would join his movement and do something for him, engage with voters, long before the election, like a year before the election. That's important because Macron knew he would get attention from the media and from the press, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. And if you're only building a movement on your success in the media and your ability to be visible in the media, at some point, when they shift attention, they forget about you. So that's the first thing he realized, building a movement around volunteers. First thing. Second thing, he knew he was the newcomer in campaigning. He had no experience. Macron, his first campaign, he ran for president, was elected. He didn't do what any regular politician would do, which is you go up the ladder step by step. So he said, as a movement, we need to rehearse. We need to get some experience. So why not try to do kind of a campaign 1 year before the election? So we'll send up volunteers, they'll knock at doors, but they won't be telling voters to vote for Macron, because at the time, Macron was not even a candidate. In terms of timing, they start the movement in April. He's a candidate in November. Okay? So he said, we're not going to tell them to get out the vote or persuasion message. We're going to ask our volunteers to ask questions, because everyone will be criticizing me for being Emmanuel Macron, the former investment banker, disconnected from the real French people. And I'm going to try to prove that they're wrong by listening to French people, not listening to people who like me, listening to all French people all across the country. And that's how the idea of this operation called La Grande Marche, which was a national listening campaign ran door to door. That's how it started. How did it work? Well, the volunteers asked 8 questions, open questions, to French people all across the country. They're very open questions. One anecdote, what do you think people answer to what works in France?
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing. What doesn't work? Everything. No, but besides that, this duo of question is interesting, because something people were saying is what works in France? Schools. And the same person would say what doesn't work? The education system. So it's interesting, because it means that what is close to you, the building where you send your kids, the school, you like it. But what's in Paris, the behemoth, the big thing you don't understand, the education system, you don't like and you're scared of. So that's interesting. Actually, it may have influenced Macron's program, in the sense that in his program he was offering to give more autonomy to local schools. So 8 questions, and people went everywhere in the country. The red dots are all the cities that were visited by volunteers for Macron. They knocked at 300,000 doors, which is nothing compared to Obama, which was probably 30 million, and Hollande in 2012, which was 5 million. But remember, they were started from scratch. They started from scratch. They had 0 volunteer in April, and this was finished by mid-July, so in 2.5 months. May, June, yeah, well, roughly. In 3.5 months, they managed to set up a professional campaign with organizers and 6,000 volunteers who engaged a conversation with 25,000 French people. The difference between 300,000 and 25,000 is not every door open, and not everyone was willing to spend 14 minutes, that's the average duration of the conversation, with volunteers. But eventually, 25,000 conversations, that means they gathered a diagnostic of France, very different from what pollsters would say, or what focus group would say, or what the press would say, or what other elected people would say. So it was a different angle, and eventually it amounted to, I think, 1.5 times the book War and Peace by Tolstoy. I'm saying that I don't know if it's as interesting or as long to read, but my point is that they could read it, and they did that. They read it, and Macron presented his program, the diagnostic in October, and used that as a basis to build. It was one of the sources to build the program. The idea is that experts are great, but if you could put an expert with reality in front of him, maybe he will come up with more practical ideas, more easier to implement. And maybe to conclude, other benefits for Macron, well, it sent a very powerful message to everyone who accused him of being a newcomer in politics who didn't know anything. Well, he responded by organizing a very professional campaign. People who said he was disconnected, he told them, well, you've been running big parties for a lot of time, and you've never listened to citizens. You talk, but you don't listen. It was a rehearsal of the campaign in the sense that many of the people who went to Congress and became congressmen afterwards started as organizer in this campaign. So it was a good way to identify people who would become the pillars of the movement, and it was an accelerator to structure the movement and start from zero to something that resembled a professional political movement after 6 months.
Great. Thank you, Guillaume. So we've seen this accelerator movement, this bottom-up from nowhere, starting knocking on doors, and they fast forward to winning the presidential election for Macron, and then winning the parliamentary election that follows, getting 62% of the seats with their coalition partners, Modem. So I guess, Sudhir, we want to ask you, how's it gone since? First of all, Macron, soon after he's elected, addresses the nation from Versailles, the home of the Sun King, and he projects an image that doesn't seem to be necessarily of the people. It's above the people. I have become elected, and now I represent all of France, and so I need to have a little grandeur. How's that going down? What are the challenges it leads to?
Well, it's very interesting if you look at the entire period since his election. I mean, initially his ratings were kind of sky high, and then they took something of a tumble, and they kept going down actually until about late November, early December, and then they picked up again, and now they're more or less back to where they were around the time that he was elected. So already in this relatively short period, there's been quite a bit of turbulence in terms of the way the French people have viewed his presidency. And what I think that suggests, above all, is that people are still slightly unclear about what Macronism actually means and signifies. And I think part of the reason for that, and that's what I want to touch on briefly in my comments, part of the reason for that is because the president himself has deliberately cultivated an ambiguity about the identity of his movement. It's an ambiguity that has served his movement very well in campaigning and in the course of running for election. It's unclear, however, to me, that that kind of ambiguity can continue to serve him when he governs. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So Pepper asked us to be trenchant, so I'll try and say 5 things trenchantly. Number one, I think when you're any president, but Macron in particular, faces an inherent tension when relating to his own party. There's a kind of structural tension in the relationship between a president and his own political party, which is, on the one hand, a president has to look presidential. And looking presidential means looking Jupiterian, means, at least since the days of the founding of the Fifth Republic by General de Gaulle used to use this expression, I'm above parties. So every president has tried, to a certain extent, to be and to look above party. And that's something that Macron himself has followed overtly. So pretty much the day after his election, he resigned from Marche. He's kept the appearance of a kind of arm's length relationship with the party. But of course, ever since de Gaulle, everybody knows the president runs his party. He runs all the kind of major decisions that take place are decisions that take place according to the president's wishes. And it's that tension that a president always has to manage carefully. If he stays too far from his party, he loses control of it. And President Hollande lost control of his party and lost control of his parliamentary party. And he paid a very, very heavy price for it. And it's a price, and it was a deflation of his authority that Macron witnessed en live, as they say in French. And I think that's something that has really struck him and perhaps has pushed him a little bit too far in trying to kind of control En Marche, because he's really paranoid that En Marche will slip away from him in the way that the Socialist Party slipped away from François Hollande. So that's the first point, the inherent tension, right? You have to look presidential and remote, but you also have to be able to control the organization. The second issue is novelty. Macron campaigned very much on the single word, révolution, which was the title of his very successful pamphlet. And so he promised innovation. And I think one of the difficulties that he's facing since his election is people keep asking, well, where is this revolution that you promised us? And that goes to the heart of something that hopefully we can discuss a little bit more, which is what can a political revolution look like in a French political context in the early 21st century? There are certain things that he wants to do that are potentially revolutionary, reconciling the French people with market capitalism. That would be a great thing. You know, a lot of presidents have tried to do this and have failed. So if Macron can achieve this, that would be something revolutionary. And I think the evidence so far, I mean, we've only had less than a year, but the evidence so far is quite mixed on the radical stroke revolutionary front. I think the most radical thing about him is his own personality. He himself is the most fundamental change, because of course he comes from the outside. He doesn't have the traditional baggage that French politicians have. You know, you have to start off, if you take the career of somebody like Chirac, he started in the mid-60s as a kind of local municipal councillor and then slowly worked his way up to the top. Macron is really different in that respect. And arguably, he's actually shattered the kind of paradigm of French politics, right? There were certain rules that you were meant to follow in order to become president and party leader. And he's shown that there's a different way that you can pursue. So those things are revolutionary. What he's actually done so far, rather less so. And indeed, his critics say that if you look at the people around him, if you look at the sociological composition of his advisors, for example, then you are dealing with somebody who comes from a very, very characteristic French ruling class background. He's surrounded by people from the École Nationale d'Administration, the ENARC. There are 53 of his close advisors. There are about 53 people in the Élysée. 36 are men, right? So it's a very masculine group. Very kind of alpha male, as it's described by some of his critics. So if you look at him sociologically, rather than in terms of what he's doing, sometimes it's very difficult to see a great difference between himself and his predecessors. But that's something that we can talk about. I think one of the things that's interesting, but also frustrating about him in this respect is he's deliberately slippery. He deliberately cultivates this ambiguity. I'd go so far as to say that he's the first really postmodern president, because he borrows elements from a lot of different ideas, personalities, figures, from de Gaulle to Sarkozy. Sarkozy, in a rare moment of humility, described Macron as c'est moi, mais en mieux. It's me, but a better version of me. So that kind of sums him up in one way. So that's the novelty, point number 2. Point number 3, control freakery. Again, his critics say he wants to keep things on a very, very tight leash. And if you look at his relationship with his party, that's absolutely been the case. Since the election, the first thing that En Marche had to do was choose a president of the parliamentary group. There was no election. Macron chose a man called Richard Ferrand, who was one of his close advisors, to become the head of the parliamentary group. He waited for 3 or 4 months and then decided, actually rather reluctantly, but in the end decided that the party needed a leader. Initially, he was reluctant even to allow that because he was worried about the Hollande precedent. But anyway, after 5 months, there was a congress in November of La République en Marche, and there was only one candidate, who was the president's candidate, very nice, able man called Christophe Castaner, and he was elected by acclamation. Right? There wasn't even a secret ballot. So the party organization is very, very closely controlled. But that's not a huge surprise because this is very much in the mold of, as I say, the relationship between presidents and their parties under the Fifth Republic. In this respect, Macron is just a rather better version of his recent predecessors, right? Who tried to control their party and in some cases failed. But Macron so far is controlling La République en Marche very closely. Final 2 points, strengths and weaknesses. What are the strengths and weaknesses of La République en Marche? Biggest strength, I mean, to run a party, you need money. La République en Marche, because it elected so many MPs, has a huge treasure chest. The Socialist Party at the other end of the spectrum is broke, right? They've just had to sell their wonderful building Rue de Solferino. They sold it for 450 million euros or something like that. But basically, no money at all. La République en Marche is flush. And so with money, you can do lots of things. You can think about things. You can plan ahead. And in terms of having the resources to move forward, La République en Marche is very well set up. Second worry that Macron had, the cohesion of the parliamentary group. But if you look at what's happened since the summer, there's been very little serious disagreements among the parliamentarians. There are what I would call subcultures within such a large group. There are about 312, 313 parliamentarians. So it's inevitable that different sort of sensibilities will emerge. But there aren't fundamental ideological disagreements. It's largely a kind of technocratic group. So in that sense, I think he can be relatively content with the way things are going at that level. Weaknesses, I think the biggest weakness is, and this goes back to what I began my remarks with, En Marche doesn't really know what its purpose is anymore, now that it's no longer in campaign mode. The parliamentarians know what their role is, right? I mean, their role is to vote the laws that the president puts before them. But the party, the grassroots, all these people who mobilized, who organized these discussions, these local deliberations, all of that which played such an important role as an election, this is no longer happening. And this is one of the kind of biggest challenges for Christophe Castaner as the new, I was about to say leader, but he's not even called leader. He's called something like delegate. So power is delegated to him by the president. He's not the actual leader. But anyway, Castaner's major headache is to actually work out how to reconnect the party to the grassroots. Theoretically, things are looking good because En Marche is supposed to have something like 400,000 members. But it's very easy to join, a couple of clicks, and you're a member. I joined this afternoon before coming to this. Exactly. But most people agree, and when you interview local organizers, they tell you that of the 400,000, there are probably only around 10% who are what we would call in political science active members.
Do you have to pay to join?
And it's free.
It's free?
It's free. So that's another. It's not the largest party. The largest party in France is La France Insoumise of Mélenchon, which has 500,000. But La France Insoumise and La République en Marche are the two biggest organizations. And the other parties, the other so-called mainstream parties, and even the Front National are now in serious crisis. The Front National only has about 40,000 members, for example, to give you a sense of the huge disparity. So So this is the biggest challenge, giving this organization, which had a clear vocation and purpose in campaigning, giving this organization a new vocation and a new purpose when the party is in government. By way of conclusion, where are we now? I think Macron is still in a relatively strong position politically, because one of his greatest achievements, alongside the minor thing of getting himself elected, one of his greatest achievements in getting himself elected was the way in which he completely fragmented the opposition, his opposition. And one of the very clever things he's managed to do during the campaign and in fact since he's become president is to continue in that vein. And he's done two things which I think are going to serve him very well over the next 5 years. The first thing is he's divided the moderate right and the moderate left internally. So there are people on the moderate right and on the moderate left who are pro-Macron and anti-Macron. So there are internal fragmentations within the moderate right and the moderate left. But his greatest political achievement is to make the extremes on both sides his principal adversaries, right? So he deliberately presents Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon as his main opponents. And of course, the point of doing that is that you create a huge political space in the center, which you then have a vocation to occupy. So in that respect, I think he has set things up for himself politically in a very effective way. And the very final point is he also has this quality that Napoleon used to describe as being essential, which is la chance. You have to have la chance when you're in campaign. And he continues to have la chance even as he is president, not least because if you look at the international environment, and if you think of the Western world and the sources of potential leadership that we might find in the Western world, we're not getting it from the United States. We thought we might get it from Germany, but Angela Merkel is hampered by the rather disastrous election result of a few months ago. Britain, I won't say anything much. I don't need to. So Emmanuel Macron is the only person left standing, and that also very much plays in his hands.
Great, thank you, Sudhir. So la chance, just good fortune, has played a role in Macron's good performance. We're going to turn to Lord Adonis now, because I know there are many people in the audience who came interested in France, but interested in France because they wanted to apply the lesson elsewhere. And one place one could think about applying this lesson is in the United Kingdom, where the divisions aren't just in the opposition, but they're actually in the government. And you had Paddy Ashdown give an interview to Politico recently where he said the certain outcome of the next election is a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour majority unless there's an En Marche type movement. And there's a movement going around the country called Renew, giving speeches in opposition to Brexit, trying to muster up a group of the centre. Lord Adonis, do they have a chance?
No.
Now that is a trenchant answer. Yes, perhaps you could say more.
So it's really interesting listening to Guillaume and to Sudhir. And Sudhir, I should say, and I go back a very long way. I mean, we were both discussing politics and political science in Nuffield College more decades ago than I care to mention. But in fact, my political background goes back further than that, because we have had a new party in this country of the centre, the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, that was formed in 1981, and it's vividly etched on my mind because I joined it on my 18th birthday. I was one of these political ingenues who thought it was wonderful. My great hero, indeed he's become an even greater hero in my life in the last 2 years since Brexit, is Roy Jenkins, who is probably, apart from Nigel Lawson, the greatest intellectual figure in politics in the last 2 generations. Nigel Lawson was the brains behind Margaret Thatcher, and indeed actually the brains behind Brexit as well. He's been probably the single most influential figure in British politics, apart possibly from Nigel Farage since the resignation of Tony Blair, and possibly since the resignation of Margaret Thatcher. But Roy was a great hero of mine, and I joined the SDP because of Roy Jenkins. You know, when I was 12, the first political book I read was Roy Jenkins' biography of Asquith, which is, you know, the great quintessential early 19th century liberal figure, you know, who took on the House of Lords, who introduced pensions, who was Balliol. I mean, he was my model. Indeed, he was Roy's model as well, you know, the great liberal, but also the great patriarch, you know, the effortless Balliol superiority, but also the great liberal establishment figure. The SDP failed, and so I was actually, this is very, very emotional for me coming back here, because I was the one SDP member of Oxford City Council. I did exactly all the things that Guillaume said. I knocked on pretty well every door. My ward was North Oxford, which is roughly here. You know, St Bernard's Road is where my constituency, my ward secretary lived. Walton Street is where my ward chairman lived. I used to cycle around all the wards. I can tell you almost what goes on in every house around here. Indeed, I gave planning permission, or refused to give planning permission, which is often more controversial, to about half of the buildings in this vicinity. My first election was for the Central Ward in Oxford, which I lost for the SDP by 23 votes. And when you lose an election by 23 votes, for the next year you go and you can see all of the 23 people who should have voted for you and failed to do so. And then the following year, I won by, which in a very bad year actually for the SDP, because it was the year that Margaret Thatcher won her third election victory in 1987. I won by 400, having learnt a lot about campaigning in the interim. So I'm instinctively very sympathetic to new figures, new parties, particularly parties of the centre. But the SDP failed massively, and it's interesting to consider why it failed. But I think a large part of the reason why it failed is because of our parliamentary system. And a large part of the reason, as I see it, looking at it as an outsider, but this is a dialogue, why I think En Marche succeeded was because of a presidential system. If we'd had a presidential system in Britain in the 1980s, I think the SDP would probably have won through, particularly if it had Shirley Williams as its leader. Shirley Williams was by far the most charismatic figure in the early mid-80s. She was the second reason why I joined the SDP. And if we'd had a presidential system, we'd had to produce a presidential candidate, I think Shirley would have been that candidate. But we don't have a presidential system, we have a parliamentary system, and our parliamentary system depends upon elections in 650 constituencies. It depends on having a machine in each of those constituencies, and a machine, because I remember, the old adage, when you're running away from a lion, how fast do you need to run? What's the answer? If you're running away from a lion, how fast do you need to run to survive? Yeah, just faster than the other guy. The problem is when you're up against a machine, like in the case of the SDP, because it was taking on the Labour Party, the Labour Party machine, well, the Labour Party has paid organisers, members, all of that in every constituency in the country. It has all the incumbent MPs, which is vitally important in our system because incumbents have huge, in terms of organisation and all that, and they have a huge advantage. And the SDP couldn't mirror any of those. And what also became clear to me, because I was in the SDP, and then the SDP, when the 83 election happened, the first election the SDP found, it did quite well in terms of the popular vote. It got 26% of the vote, which is bad. The Labour Party got 28%, but the difference was the Labour Party with 28% and its organisation, it concentrated organisation in urban and working class Britain. For its 28%, it got 209 seats, and the SDP with its 26% got 23 seats in alliance with the Liberal Democrats, well, the Liberals as then was, and then they forged to become the Liberal Democrats. Well, whereas success in politics and indeed in life tends to breed success, failure in politics and indeed in life tends to breed failure. And the failure to break through in 1983 meant that the SDP, far from thinking this was a great bridgehead, we've got this 26% of the vote, we've got these 23 MPs, now we can, en marche, we can go ahead and all that. What actually happened, of course, is the party turned in on itself. And it didn't matter that the ideological space that it occupied was quite narrow, much narrower actually than either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. I can assure you in politics, the capacity of people to turn on each other because they agree is only exceeded by their capacity to turn on each other in academic life because it doesn't matter at all. You know what Henry Kissinger famously said, why are academic disputes so bitter? Because the stakes are so low. Well, when you're an opposition party, which is doing bad sadly, the stakes are almost equally low. And the arguments that took place between the Owenites, the Jenkinsites, and those people who didn't actually, in policy terms, disagree on anything at all, they were legendary. And then we had this big, organisational argument about whether the SDP should remain a separate party, whether it should merge with the Liberal Democrats, or should we have an alliance with the Liberal Democrats? I can assure you, the amount of hours, so I was a councillor at this happening, I had to negotiate it all here in Oxford as to what we were going to do. We literally split into 3 factions on this question about going solo, which was the pure option, total merger, or partial merger. And the partial merger led to arguments about how we're going to select candidates, were they going to be joint open selection, joint closed? So, I mean, you just didn't need to go here at all. So that was all a great disaster. And having gone through that traumatic experience, I didn't stand for re-election. I went off and became a journalist. I thought that was the way I was going to change the world. And then, quite by chance, I met Tony Blair. And he asked me to go and work for him. Now, Tony Blair is Emmanuel Macron. I mean, they're almost indistinguishable. I mean, I've seen it all before. And Tony Blair, by the way, was Hugh Gateskill, who was leader of the Labour Party in the early 60s. These figures, these very charismatic centrist figures, they recur in democracies like ours. They come round in cycles. And Tony Blair, the difference between Tony Blair and Emmanuel Macron is that Tony Blair did a reverse takeover of the Labour Party, which he did with an established party which had the organisation, had the MPs and all of that. And Emmanuel Macron set up his own party. Now, Macron probably had to set up his own party, because unless I misunderstand French politics, he couldn't have become leader of the Socialist Party. I mean, he wasn't in the pecking order, and Emmanuel Valls was there and others. They all told him he was far too young and he needed to wait his turn and all that. So he had to set up a new party if he was going to leapfrog and stand a chance of becoming president. Otherwise, he would be, well, presumably he'd be in opposition now, because the right would have won. So he had no choice. In the case of Tony Blair, though, the setting up of a new party had been tried and failed. And the moral that he and the radical moderates in the Labour Party drew from that is do not set up a new party, work from the inside and do a reverse takeover. That was the strategy, and that is precisely what Tony Blair did. It was essentially a Liberal Democrat takeover of the Labour Party. And I vividly remember, after the 1992 election, which of course was the 3rd election in a row that the Labour Party had lost, and they had a sort of moderately modernising candidate, Neil Kinnock, who's a bit like Hollande. I mean, quite sort of similar sort of interim candidates, really. And I remember having lunch with Tony Blair immediately after the 1992 election when he was very, very depressed. He said it was all hopeless because the Conservatives had just won their 4th election in a row. They were, even though it wasn't by many seats, they were a long way ahead in the vote. They were 7% ahead in the vote. When it came to the crunch and people had to decide which way they were going to go, they went for the right, not for the left. They went for self-interest, not for altruism, all these other things. And I remember him going through at the lunch all of the things that needed to be done, which are pretty well the sorts of things that Emmanuel Macron says. We need a party that's above class. It needs to be modern. It has to have a new image. It's got to identify both with the established interests, but also it's got to have the entrepreneurs and the new people and all of that. It was all of that. And I remember, because this is what I'd spent the last 10 years when I'd been in politics trying to do. And he said to me, do you think that works? And I said, no, it won't work. It's not enough. And he said, why? What else have we got to do? And I said, no, it's the name. I said, you won't get anything elected, I said, that's got the name Labour attached. It's just not going to work in 1990s Britain. It's not aspiration. It doesn't deal with England and southern England in particular, which has never voted for Labour governments. He said, well, what do you suggest? And I said, well, how about Liberal Democrats? And he said, ha, 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 he said. But in fact, he did do all of that, including when he did his reverse takeover of the Labour Party, changing the name, New Labour, which was deliberately presented and pitched as a new party, nothing to do with the old party, a completely new entity. The fact that you had all these people who were serving Labour MPs and all of that is neither here nor there. So the moral I draw from all this is that you absolutely need to find your leader. You absolutely need to find your leader. You can do nothing in politics without leaders. Democratic parties underestimate the power of leaders because they pretend that they're democratic. I mean, it's very refreshing hearing Sudhir because there's no pretense of democracy in On Marche. Actually, in all parties which are successful, there's no pretense of democracy. Essentially, what political parties are is franchise operations which are franchised to leaders. And either the leader is good or they're bad. They may have democratic forms and pretenses, but they are democratic forms and pretenses. When Tony Blair was electorally successful and could walk on water, you know, when he was roughly where Macron is at the moment, he chose everybody who mattered in the Labour Party. He didn't even bother to go to meetings of the Labour National Executive Committee. He regarded it as superfluous. I never forget, on one occasion when there was a vote that they thought that mattered, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party was summoned to 10 Downing Street to meet on the grounds it was inconvenient for the Prime Minister to go to the party headquarters. You know, that's what this supposedly great democratic party, that's what it was like then. So you need to find the leader. In our system, because it's a parliamentary system, the leader, with very, very rare exceptions, needs to be from within the established parties, not between them. But can I just make two concluding comments on it, though, just looking at the French experience? You can, in our system, be a very, very successful leader if you don't want elected office. Because never forget that the most successful politician, probably, in the last 20 years has been Nigel Farage, who's never been elected to the House of Commons. He has done a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party, an almost complete reverse takeover of the Conservative Party. He controls its policy. He does a lot to control its candidates. He took a lot of its funders away from it. He controls a lot of the financial resources of the party. He's constantly threatening to come back, and when he threatens to come back, you know, he sends tremors through about half of the Conservative Party. He is, as I'm now writing a book on this whole phenomenon, because I'm campaigning, the big thing I'm doing at the moment is campaigning to try and keep Britain in the European Union. And Farage is, to all intents and purposes, the Prime Minister at the moment. He has all of the power of the Premiership without holding the office. Theresa May holds the office, but it's Nigel Farage who wields the power. If you just look at what Nigel Farage has, what Theresa May's been saying in the last few days about the customs union, and how she daren't even negotiate a position that keeps us within a customs union with our European partners. Pure Farage. My second comment is about Macron himself. Macron himself, though he did have a lot of these features, my reading of it is that he was also an extraordinary fluke. An extraordinary fluke. He happened to come to the fore at precisely the time when Hollande was imploding on the left. And then he had this amazing stroke of good fortune, la chance, this amazing stroke of good fortune, that the candidate of the mainstream right imploded, literally imploded. He got involved in a massive expenses and sex and all that scandal, employing his wife and all that, at precisely the moment when you were coming up to the first round. Now, my reading of the votes in the first round is that if Fillon hadn't imploded, Macron would never have got within a million miles of the Élysée Palace. Fillon would have won. I mean, he was on course to win. What happened? And indeed, actually, it wasn't that decisive even on the first round. Wasn't it something like 24%, 21%, 19%, 17%? It was something like that, wasn't it? So if you take out of the equation the fact that because of this extraordinary fluke, the candidate of the mainstream right, who was almost bound to win, and everybody thought it was good, the only question was who the candidate was going to be, whether it was going to be Sarkozy reinvented, or whether it was going to be Fillon, or wasn't there a third one in there? Juppé and all that. It would have been him. So he was very lucky. Now, you do need to put yourself forward in order to be lucky. You can't be lucky spontaneously and not be there. So the fact that he went for, you do actually need, as Bill Clinton famously said, politics is made by those people who show up. You've got to show up in order to have a chance. He did show up. But given all of the circumstances around the place, the thing that should have happened is that he showed up, came a respectable third or fourth, put down a marker, and probably either Fillon had to do a deal with him and with his grouping, or he could have become heir apparent, depending which way he decided to go, to a new party. But that didn't happen. So there was a remarkable element of the chance about it, even within a presidential system which enables this to happen. But my final comment is final comment is about François Mitterrand, who I think is in many ways the most extraordinary leader of modern France. And there's that biography by Philip Short, which is the single best political biography that I've read in the last 15 years, about this extraordinary reinvention, because all French presidents, almost all of them, have been extraordinary individuals, amazing individuals. De Gaulle, what a story that is. Mitterrand, the guy who served Vichy, who was probably, I mean, he did a very good job of covering up all his traces, but appears to be not just on the right, but on the far right in the late 30s and early 40s, who then is a minister in all of these Fourth Republic governments, and a pretty authoritarian minister and all that, who then reinvents himself as a socialist. There's no evidence to me that he ever believed in socialism. I mean, it was just a pretense and a front for wielding power. And what did Mitterrand actually believe in? He believed, like de Gaulle, in his supreme capacity and destiny to wield power. And what did Mitterrand say was the supreme quality in politics? Indifference. And it looks to me as if Macron has got it in abundance. Tony Blair had it, is the politician who I have worked with in life, in my career, who exemplifies indifference to the highest degree.
Great.
Thank you.
So if you came here thinking centrist politics is boring, I hope we've disabused you. But we've held you a long time, and we're very interested to hear views from the audience. So we'd like to take questions, and we'll take them in sets of 3, and you'll have microphones coming from the back. Please say who you are, state your question, remembering that brevity is the soul of wit, and your question should end with a question mark. And we'll take 3 at a time to be aimed at the panelists. Over here.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm from the MPP program here at Blavatnik. So my question is the second question on the slide here, the will it last? And the reason I ask is because I'm a Democrat back home, and since 2008, when we were knocking doors in New Hampshire for Mr. Obama, the organizing principle of the Democratic Party has essentially been Barack Obama, and without it, the party seems to be sort of at sea right now. And I'm curious that for a party that shares its initials with Mr. Macron, if you take the EM out of EM, does it survive?
Great. Right behind, Felipe.
Yeah, it's a very, very related question. So, because this kind of movements, I'm from Brazil. I was there with you, Guillaume, last Thursday. And there are a lot of movements now in Brazil that talk about political renovation. And once the people that are in the movement get elected, they serve the movement, they serve the country, but what about the movement? For example, with Marche, what happens after Macron doesn't exist, and what is its purpose outside electing people?
Great, and we've got a question here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Danny. I'm a doctoral student at New College. I study the political center, and I also took Marshall Ganz's class. So I just want to say, I believe, Sudhir, you mentioned that Macron's great strength has been to fracture the opposition. And I want to know, is he the one who's fractured the opposition, or in the height of irony, is it not Mélenchon and Le Pen who have fractured the opposition, and he, in fact, depends on them to maintain this position?
Okay, great. I actually, there was a hand in the back. Let's get one more question in, and we will take a second round. Don't worry, those who had their hands up. I'm trying to get as many voices in without overtaxing the panelists cognitively.
Hi, my name is Manuel Costescu. I'm an ex-MP from Romania. My question is actually about how do you succeed to turn a movement into a disciplined party without splitting it across ideological lines? And Marche didn't have an ideology. How do you make sure that the 300-something MPs don't start taking strong views on the left and on the right on values, such as, I don't know, religion, homosexuality, or things that are topical, which have destroyed the party I was part of?
Great. Guillaume, we're going to give you the word first, and you're going to model brevity in response.
So first of all, yes, Macron was lucky. So of course he was lucky, but he was very, in a campaign, you probably control less than half of what happens to you. He was very good at working on what he could control, and then he hoped for the best. And the best happened in the sense that some of his opponents collapsed, opening something in the center. But now he's president, and now he's in power, and En Marche is a very well-structured and powerful movement. But the problems of France have not disappeared. The populism has not disappeared like this. There are still many people who support Marine Le Pen, who support a view that has not disappeared. And for me, if I were to judge the success of En Marche in 5 years, I would judge it by the ability to prove to French citizens who think politics is not for them, that politics has abandoned them, that actually, no, it's not true. And it's possible to get them back. And I believe that this can't happen overnight. There's no magic stick. Maybe Barack Obama was a magic stick, but maybe Emmanuel Macron was a magic stick for the election. But now the time is about change that will take time. You know, François Hollande said his motto was "Change is now." I think, as you know, change is now and a bit tomorrow, and then the day after tomorrow. And step by step, maybe you can change people's perception in politics if you listen to them, and that was the idea of Macron, like to listen to French people. If you act on that, so if you just listen to tell them you listen, but then you don't act on it, you don't use what they say, you're going to disappoint them. That's the second thing. And there's another thing which I think is very important to understand Macron, and why he may not have a very clear ideology. Macron is also about the method. And I think that, you know, if you want to change France, it's not only about finding the one idea that nobody has found before. I think it's a lot about conducting change, having a powerful narrative that people can, you know, can accept, can understand, so that they're willing to make sacrifices so that you can change the country. It's not so much about, you know, big ideologies like it was like 30, 40 years ago. It's also about the method. And Macron, you know, big difference with his predecessors, is incredibly professional. I've seen the Élysée work with Hollande. I've seen the Élysée work with Macron. It has nothing to do. They're professionals. I think it does matter. I have to say I'm a former McKinsey consultant. I have no heart. So I believe in management and processes. No, jokes aside, of course, politics is also about having a heart, having a good narrative. And I think this is also one of the weaknesses of Macron, which is he doesn't have a very powerful and compelling narrative. His main idea was, let's change politics. That's good for an election, but then the question is, what's next? And I'll give you one example. You know we have European elections next year. If you're British, you can't vote.
Don't worry, when have we joined by then?
Yeah, okay. That'd be nice, because I live in London. I want to continue to live in London. But one of the problems in Europe, with Europe, the European Union, is that people don't really understand. They can't relate to it. They feel it's something distant that just imposes constraint, but does not provide, you know, good stuff for average, you know, French people. And Macron is doing En Marche is doing the exact same listening campaign, but on Europe, starting at the end of March. So they're going to listen to to French citizens and let them speak with their words about the European Union. The idea is to understand how you can change people's perception of Europe. It's very interesting to let people speak and then use that to build a better narrative and a better discourse. And I believe that this could also be something, if you want to change, you know, the British people's mind about Europe. I live in London, in a neighborhood called Stoke Newington, that probably voted 90% for Remain. And I don't know anyone who voted Brexit. Well, I think it's a problem, because I can't, you know, picture what other people think. So I can't understand, you know, why they voted. And so then that's how you build your own bubble. And if politics is a sum of bubbles, I think it can't work. And at some point, it's gonna burst. So my response to what can you do with the movement, and Macron, I think, understood this, is you can use it as a powerful tool to continue to listen to French citizens, and then step by step show them that you're going to use, you know, what they told you. But again, it won't happen overnight. It won't be a magic stick. But you know, at some point, France is a very old country, so it's okay to be patient, I think.
Sudhir, only 20% of the French identify themselves as being of the center. Can En Marche survive without splitting itself, and can it survive Emmanuel Macron?
It can survive. I mean, if you think of the Fifth Republic, the greatest example of survival, I mean, there are two very good examples of survival across leaders. Gaullism is one, right? Everybody thought initially, you know, a political movement like Gaullism, which is so closely focused around an individual, Gaullism without de Gaulle almost didn't seem to make any sense. Yet, you know, some of the best moments of the Gaullist movement came after the death of de Gaulle. Best in terms of electoral and political success. So it is possible to continue a particular in a particular trajectory, provided you know what the trajectory is. It takes me back to my original point. And I think the clearest thing one can say about what we believe this trajectory to be is that Macron comes from this kind of centrist, reformist tradition in France, which, because France has a history of being ideologically polarized, has actually two strands. There's a center-left and a center-right, which, because France, you know, is always, the blocs are always at war with each other. One of the ironies of French political history is that the center-right and the center-left have never effectively cooperated. And what Macron is trying to do is to bring them together. And if he's able to do that, make the center-right and the center-left hold together in a broad-based political movement, then I think the prospects for survival are there. But as the French say, ce n'est pas gagné. You know, because although, I mean, going back to Andrew's points, the differences, the ideological differences between the center-left and the center-right may be small, but actually there's all kinds of other differences that are there, temperamental, historical, cultural, and they may eventually bring the house down or create constraints. In terms of survival, one other thing that I wanted to mention is we know En Marche doesn't have a kind of existing grassroots organization, and it needs to build that. The other thing it needs to do is actually anchor itself in the French municipal network. And the municipal elections that are coming up in 2020 are going to be absolutely decisive, right, for the future of the movement. And we're not talking here about the next 10, 15 years. It's immediate, right? If En Marche doesn't capture Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, it's going to be in real trouble, right? So you'll be able to gauge from what happens in those elections what the future of the political movement is. In terms of the question about opposition, I hear you. Some of those divisions were already there, but I think Macron's talent as a political tactician is knowing how to exploit those divisions to his advantage. And I think if you look at the way he actually identified the lines of fracture within the socialists and within the Républicains and played on them, notably by appointing Edouard Philippe as prime minister, which has just caused absolute mayhem in the Républicains, absolute mayhem. They don't know whether to throw him out of the party. I mean, his status is still unclear. They're still arguing about it since Edouard Philippe has been elected. And I'm not sure what conclusion they've actually reached. And I don't think they know either. And so that's a kind of very good example of how just by very small but decisive moves, you can actually sow discord amongst the opposition.
So, Lord Adonis, you talked about yourself as an 18-year-old political ingenue. There are people in this room who are 22, 25, and they consider themselves political ingenue. They're inspired by this, and they want to generate change, and they may even want to generate change in Britain. Your counsel seems to be the two parties are not for being taken, and so your plight is hopeless.
Well, get involved in one of the two parties. Try and do your own reverse takeover of particularly the Conservative Party, which is ripe for it at the moment. I mean, the Conservative Party has almost no members under the age of 75. So if you come as a 25-year-old and you're active, I mean, the world is your oyster. So I would just get involved. But I think also great causes matter as well. The single biggest cause in British politics in the next 14 months is whether we stay in the European Union or not. And that divides both parties. And there's a massive campaign getting going in the Labour Party, which is a peculiar campaign because it is an attempt at a reverse takeover of the Labour Party. When we are oddly, we have a very odd situation that we have a leader who is popular, indeed has generated large numbers of members. Interestingly, we have more members than En Marche, many more. We've got about 600,000 members, even though you have to pay. And actually, you have to pay quite a lot. I'm amazed that En Marche has so few members, considering that it's free. If you could make membership of the Labour Party free here, I think it's quite possible that with St. Jeremy as leader, we could have 1.5 million or 2 million members. I mean, I think it's distinctly possible. There's a huge surge of support out there. But the interesting thing about it is most of these members are also very strongly pro-European. They don't all live in Stoke Newington either. They are, around the country. There is this huge surge of support for Europe. And so at the moment, politics is in a very fluid state. It lacks leaders. It lacks big ideas. The single biggest ideas out there, peculiarly, are going into Europe or leaving Europe. Those are the two big ideas that dominate British politics at the moment. A big idea idea that we should continue being a European nation, a European power, a European civilization. There isn't a bigger idea than that. But the other big idea on the right is global Britain, free from the shackles of this Brussels bureaucracy, which has been eviscerating our democracy, and is, you know, and it's leading to remarkable things. I'm at the moment, because I'm on the road a lot, listening, actually doing precisely what Guillaume said, listening a lot, talking a lot, doing lots of meetings. And I have surreal experiences the whole time I was at the Durham Union. You know, the Durham is the university full of people who didn't get into this university, particularly those of sort of rightish disposition, but they're in the north, which of course is the heart of Leave. And so I sat through this surreal debate on Friday at the Durham Union on the motion, "This House regrets Brexit," where it was myself and Anna Soubry, who are, I mean, we are the sort of centre-right and the centre-left personified, both of us in revolt, essentially, against our own party leadership. We found we disagreed on almost nothing. We had to kind of slightly manufacture disagreements because it was getting a bit too embarrassing how much we were agreeing. However, on the other side, it was listening to all of these students, you know, young, who were wearing their dinner jackets and all that, which they do in these union debates, all talking, and, you know, had all been to Eton and Winchester and schools like this, all talking about their new communion with the working classes. They have never met the working class, but they think that leaving the European Union and all these people who have been betrayed by the elite, by people like Lord Adonis, they were saying, you know, actually I've got much better working class credentials than any of them, as I informed them. This is the sort of the new politics. So there are very big ideas, and if you want to get involved, if you may be that you do believe in the global Britain leaving the European Union, well, it's a great opportunity to forge a new future there, because that now needs a whole plan behind it. You know, what's going to happen to this country if we do leave the European Union in 14 months' time? God only knows. So, I mean, having an idea around that is a good thing. But if you're of my persuasion that we should stay, then what we need is a kind of en marche type movement which spans parties but is also organised within them to stay in the European Union. It needs 1 million people, it needs massive events, and it's got an objective as well, because the objective is what I now think is increasingly likely, which is the referendum that we will hold on whether or not we are ultimately going to leave. And that referendum will probably be the single most important political event in the modern history of this country, and that is a great thing to get involved in. And if you want to give me your email afterwards and all that, I will take it, because I'm getting a whole lot of stuff going on this, and I'll keep in touch with you.
We have time for 2 more questions right here, and we're going to go for the center. So the lady in the red hat.
I'm very pleased to hear all the things that you were saying, but I wondered if you could give us your view between you about Macron's view about being the leader of Europe and what his view is really about us in this country.
And then in the back, in the green jacket.
Lord Adonis, you spoke about the need for a leader. Who is going to be the leader of the movement to have another referendum? Because I don't see one, and I see, regrettably, and I see a lot of leaders of Leave still getting airtime, and I just wondered who will be that leader?
Okay, we have 1 minute each, and we're going to give Lord Adonis the last word, so Guillaume, we'll start with you.
So maybe I'll use the opportunity the question you asked, to talk a bit about, do you need a leader? I mean, what can you really learn? And do you really need does it make a difference in which political system you live in, and what can you really import for France at the moment? And I'll talk briefly about Macron's view of the UK, though I don't, I'm not speaking for him. It's easy now to forget that Macron had probably like a 1 or 2% chance of becoming the president when he started thinking about this. I mean, trust me, and I was there, and we thought it was fun. I joined the adventure on a personal level first because he asked me to. And, I thought it was fun. I really enjoyed the pleasure of being around Macron and his advisor. They're great people, very smart. They're doers, which I really like in politics. But we thought it would never work. It would just be a fun adventure. So let's not forget that. My point is that I think it's easy to look at the differences between countries. And I was in Brazil last week. I can tell you, people kept telling me that Brazil is not France. I said, yes. France is not the US, and yet we managed to use some of the Obama techniques in a very different context. I think that if I were to, I think the main lesson from my perspective as someone who has a company who works in politics is that there are certain things that you can control, and something that you cannot control. And the leader, whether you need whether you have a good leader or not, Obama, Macron, that doesn't happen very often. I ran François Hollande's field campaign in 2012. François Hollande is no Barack Obama, that's for sure. But we were able to organize a very decent campaign with a lot of direct engagement with citizens. I think that made a difference. Actually, there's even an academic paper published by my colleague Vincent Pons at Harvard that measured the effect of this campaign, and it worked. So even if you don't have a great leader, if you're able to build a movement with a solid operation, with many people who volunteer, you can do something very, very powerful. And then, of course, if you have an amazing leader, that's even better. But fortunately, you're not always that lucky. I'm not saying that. My only point is that do not wait for the leader, because otherwise you may just keep waiting and waiting and waiting and not do anything. What is Macron's view about this? Well, I think he will miss you, a lot. No, I think Macron understands why so many people in Britain rejected Europe. And he understands that this is the case in France, in Germany, in Belgium, in many other European countries. You're not alone. If a vote were to take place in France about Brexit, I'm not sure what the result could be. Maybe slightly we would win, but it wouldn't be a big victory. I mean, the Remain would win, but it wouldn't be a very big victory. So I think Macron understands that there is a problem with Europe, and that his role, if he can inspire people, is to put the citizen at the center. So what does that mean? Again, I don't believe in magical recipes. I believe that if you listen to people carefully, and then if Europe can build, again, a powerful narrative on how it can change people's lives, that will slowly, step by step, change people's perception. But this is not something that will happen overnight. Just to finish, yes, I know. I'm not Macron. I didn't speak for an hour and a half. I mean, if he were here, he would still be speaking. Okay, none of us would have spoken. No, last point is I run a startup, and I almost crashed my company 3 years ago because I did something very stupid. I forgot to listen to my customers, and so I built a product that they didn't want to buy. And I believe in politics, and so that people very often do not get out of the office enough. And I think that what Macron would tell you, but that's what exactly you're doing, is get out of the office, and maybe eventually you will, build a movement that could convince Theresa May to run another referendum. And if you need help, I'll be there.
Sudhir, briefly.
Well, I'll just try and answer this question, which I think is a huge question about what Macron's idea of Europe really is. My reading of it is that he doesn't really, I think he might regret the absence of Britain, as it were, for sentimental reasons. But I think his view, and it's a very French view, actually, of what's happened in the history of European integration over the past 20, 25 years, is that there's an economically liberal vision of Europe, and there's a social vision of Europe. And the economically liberal vision of Europe is the one that has been pushed very hard by Britain up to now, and it's one of the reasons why Europe has been failing, according to this French view, which I think Macron subscribes to. And therefore, I think in terms of the viability of the European project, I think he will see the departure of Britain as a good thing, because it will make possible a reorientation of the European project in a more social and in a much more Republican direction. So I think that's what he actually believes. Whether he'll be able to do that, because of course to do that you need German help. And you need to be able to build a kind of political coalition at the European level, which is kind of not obvious. I mean, this is where Macron is able to give kind of really great speeches, and his last speech on Europe was wonderful. But as usual, it was kind of wonderful in the kind of inspirational sense. But we don't really know what he actually concretely wants to do. But I think I have a sense that that's his aspired sense of travel. That's where he wants to go. And it's a direction in which he thinks Britain absolutely doesn't want to go in. So in that sense, I think he'd be very happy to see the back of us.
Lord Adonis, final word. There was a question in the back aimed at you as well.
Well, the leader I'd like to see take this on is Jeremy Corbyn. And I think he might end up doing it, actually, because referendums, he's not going to deliver us the referendum. We will have to have a great campaign to deliver the referendum. But he has to agree to it, because the only way it's going to happen is by a parliamentary crisis, and the parliamentary crisis requires the Labour Party to vote for it, which is what the big argument is about at the moment, is getting the Labour Party to support the referendum by essentially force majeure on Jeremy Corbyn. It's the only way it will happen, because once we've got the agreement to a referendum, then of course the campaign starts. Now the referendum campaign will be a referendum on Theresa May. Referendums always are referendums on the government. The reason that the fundamental reason why we lost the referendum 2 years ago, the fundamental reason it was a referendum on the government, and the government wasn't popular, particularly in Left Behind Britain. And the Labour Party, my party, was in a very, very difficult position in the referendum, because we were having to support an unpopular Conservative party, which was the party of the status quo. You never want to be the status quo in a referendum either. What you want to be is the insurgents against an unpopular government. Well, surprise, surprise, if we have a referendum next year, who's the unpopular government? Who's the insurgents? Who is the leader of the insurgents, potentially? I think all this adds up. So I'm a perpetual optimist. My own view is Bill Clinton, always, in politics as in life, always have a plan. It's like a sat-nav. You may have to change the plan, but you've always got to have a plan. The plan is this. There's a parliamentary crisis. I mean, the government is imploding. It's not going to implode completely, because as Adam Smith famously said of nations, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, there's a lot of ruin in governments. Governments never literally disintegrate, but there's going to be a big crisis in the autumn, because the Prime Minister will come back from Brussels with her withdrawal agreement, and the withdrawal agreement will massively divide her own party, and it will also give us, those who want to stay in, any number of targets to aim at, because she's going to have to define positions. You know, to govern is to choose. She's going to have to choose. As soon as she chooses, she has open warfare inside her own party, but also she has people like me who say, look, I mean, is this really the future of this country? No customs union, border in Ireland, xenophobia, all of this, and so we'll rally the troops against. There'll then be a parliamentary crisis which only requires 15 Conservative MPs to vote against her, because once the Labour Party's come out in favour of the referendum, it'll be like the vote in Parliament before Christmas on this thing called the meaningful votes, which is what had Dominic Grieve, Anna Soubry and the others who voted against, and the government lost that by 4 votes. It will lose that vote then on the referendum. We then either have the referendum campaign next February, or we ask our European friends to extend the Article 50 period probably till next Easter, so we can have the referendum in a more orderly way next Easter. That's then the mother of all referendum and political campaigns, but we win it by 60-40, because it's a referendum on Theresa May and a very unpopular Conservative government, which unites about a third of the Conservative Party, is led by Jeremy Corbyn, and crucially, and this is where you all come in, crucially, the under-35s vote as they have never voted before in the history of this country, because it's their future at stake. There's almost no under-35-year-olds, whether Labour, Tory or Liberal, who are against being able to live, love and work across Europe. They want this badly. They will organise not only themselves, but they will also start doing, as in the referendum campaign in Ireland on gay marriage, on equal marriage. They'll start phoning their parents and their grandparents. And so all of the movement will be in favour of staying. It will be the reinvention of this country. It will give us a massive new surge of energy. It will move Jeremy Corbyn dramatically to the centre, because it will be the only basis on which he can lead this campaign. And what Winston Churchill famously described as the sunlit uplands will redawn in this country on the 30th of March 2019. And that is the morning that you want to be alive.
So even a conversation on French politics winds up in Brexit. Thank you all very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists for a very stimulating discussion.
Good fun. Good fun.